It was August of 1971. The air in Washington hung thick and heavy, a soupy mixture of humidity and political tension. In the sub-basement of the Treasury building, however, the air was different. It was cold. It was sterile. It was the manufactured chill of recycled air, humming through vents and across the polished concrete floors of a place that was never meant to be comfortable. It was a place designed for machines and data, not for men. His name was Frank Miller. He was a nightside data clerk, a man who existed in the quiet, forgotten hours when the city slept and the real business of the nation was tallied and filed. He was 47 years old, a veteran of a war that was fading from memory, and a man who prided himself on two things: his punctuality and his precision. He was, in the parlance of the institution he served, a ghost, a reliable, invisible cog in a machine of incomprehensible scale. His job was simple, or at least it had been. He was a verifier. He took printouts from the new, room-sized mainframe computers, the ones that crunched the nation's most sensitive economic data, and he cross-referenced them with the physical ledgers from the floor above. It was a redundant system, a holdover from an earlier age, a way for the old guard to feel secure that the newfangled thinking machines were not making catastrophic errors. For Frank, it was 8 hours of quiet focus, a comfortable routine in a world that was becoming increasingly loud and chaotic. The night of August 12, 1971, started like any other. The scent of ozone from the humming tape drives, the rhythmic clatter of the line printers, the low drone of the air conditioning. He collected his first stack of green bar paper, its perforations still sharp, and carried it to his small, metal desk. The report was designated Consolidated Bullion Ledger, Internal Transfer Audit. It was a report he ran every Thursday. It was always the same. Minor adjustments, decimal point corrections, the slow, predictable movement of a nation's wealth. But not this night. He ran his finger down the first column of numbers, his eyes scanning for the familiar codes. USDPFR, New York. United States Depository, Federal Reserve, New York. The numbers beside it were supposed to represent physical gold holdings. They were supposed to be stable, immense, and predictable. Tonight, they were not. A figure jumped out at him. A negative entry. It wasn't a small adjustment. It was a number so large, so out of place, that he felt a physical jolt, as if the cold of the room had suddenly seeped into his bones. He checked the header again. Internal Transfer Audit. This was not supposed to show external movement. This was supposed to be an accounting of assets already held, merely moved between internal vaults. He blinked. The number was still there. A ghost in the machine. A figure that represented a quantity of gold so vast, it couldn't possibly be a simple transfer. It was a void. A sudden, inexplicable black hole on a ledger that was meant to be the bedrock of the nation's finances. He pulled the previous week's report from his files. The numbers were normal. He pulled the week before that. Normal. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, mingling with the artificial chill of the room. He walked over to the printer. The machine was still churning out pages, spitting forth line after line of alphanumeric code. He looked at the job queue. There was a second report running, one he had never seen before. It was labeled Project Lachesis, Phase 2 Projection. The security clearance was 3 levels above his own. It should not have been printing here. It should not have been visible to him. Section_section, but there it was. And as he watched, a line of text scrolled onto the page, a comment field that was usually left blank. It read, 0-point calibration successful. Legacy asset reconciliation complete. Legacy asset. The phrase echoed in his mind. What legacy asset? He looked back at the impossible number on his audit sheet. The void. The black hole where a nation's hoard of gold was supposed to be. He felt a wave of vertigo. He did what he was trained to do. He followed procedure. He picked up the secure line on his desk, the red phone that connected directly to the night supervisor's office 3 floors up. He reported the anomaly. He used precise language. He was calm. He was professional. He was a good cog. The response was not what he expected. There was no concern in the supervisor's voice. No request for clarification. Just a long, heavy silence. Then, a single, clipped instruction. Stay where you are, Mr. Miller. Do not touch anything. A team is coming down. The team was not the usual pair of maintenance engineers or fellow supervisors. They were 2 men in dark suits that looked out of place at 2 in the morning. They didn't have ID badges clipped to their pockets. They didn't speak to him. They didn't even look at him. They went straight to the printer, tore off the reports, and fed them into a portable shredder. They took his logbook. They took the previous week's reports from his file cabinet. One of them finally turned to him. His face was pale. His eyes were flat and empty. "You saw a printing error," the man said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A fact being created right there, in the cold, sterile air of the sub-basement. There was a power surge, the second man added, his voice equally devoid of emotion. It affected the mainframe. "All data from the past hour is corrupted. You will sign a report to that effect." Frank Miller, the man who prided himself on precision, was being asked to certify a lie. He looked from the cold, empty eyes of the man in front of him to the humming tape drives that held the truth. He thought about his pension. He thought about his quiet life. He was a ghost, and ghosts are supposed to remain unseen. He signed the report. The next day, Frank Miller was reassigned. He was moved to the General Services Administration, tasked with auditing paperclip and stationery inventories. His security clearance was revoked. His access to the Treasury building was erased. He was, for all intents and purposes, a non-person. He never set foot in that sub-basement again. 3 days later, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television. He announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed value. The gold window was closed. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The world was told it was a temporary measure, a necessary step to combat speculators and stabilize the economy. Frank Miller, sitting in his small apartment, counting paper clips in his mind, knew better. He had seen the real ledger. He had seen the void. He understood that the window wasn't just closed. It was closed because the store was empty. But here is what they don't want you to know. Frank Miller's story is not an isolated incident. It is not the rambling of a disgruntled clerk. It is a single, flickering candle in a vast, dark room, illuminating for a brief moment a truth so profound and so terrifying that an entire system has been constructed to keep you from seeing it. The official history of the 20th century is a carefully curated narrative. It is a story of wars, of political movements, of technological progress, and of economic cycles. It is a story told by the victors, written by the academics, and enforced by the institutions that govern our lives. But what if this history is incomplete? What if the major events we have all been taught to accept as reactive, as mere responses to crisis, were in fact something else entirely? What if they were planned? The central thesis is this: the economic history of the modern world is a lie. The abandonment of the gold standard in 1971 was not a desperate measure to save a failing system. It was the final, triumphant activation of a plan set in motion decades earlier. It was a coup, a silent, bloodless coup against the very concept of real, tangible wealth. And the gold confiscation of 1933, the event that history books dismiss as a drastic but necessary response to the Great Depression, was not a response at all. It was a dress rehearsal. It was practice. Welcome to the story they tried to erase. A story of how your wealth was stolen, not in 1971, but in a slow, methodical process that began long before you were born. A story of how gold, the anchor of value for 5,000 years, was not just abandoned, but deliberately and systematically replaced by a system of absolute control. To understand the crime, you must first understand the weapon. And to understand the weapon, you must go back to the beginning. You must go back to 1933. The official narrative is simple and taught to every high school student. In 1933, America was in the grips of the Great Depression. The banking system was collapsing. People, terrified, were hoarding gold, pulling it out of the banks and draining the nation's reserves. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a bold and decisive move to save the economy, issued Executive Order 6102. The order forbade the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Citizens were required to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency at a fixed rate of $2,067 per ounce. They say it was to stop the panic. They say it was to allow the Federal Reserve to increase the money supply and stimulate the economy. They say it was a painful but necessary sacrifice for the common good. They are lying. Let us first look at the order itself. It was not a law passed by Congress. It was an executive order enacted under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a law passed during World War I to control transactions with hostile nations. In 1933, the enemy was not a foreign power. The enemy, apparently, was the American citizen. The enemy was anyone who believed that a physical ounce of gold in their hand was more real than a paper promise from the government. Think about the sheer audacity of this act. A government, by decree, declared the private ownership of a specific form of property to be a criminal act. Not just any property. The one form of property that had served as the ultimate store of value for all of recorded human history. Imagine, for a moment, if the government today were to issue an order demanding you turn in all your real estate, or your stocks, or your artwork, in exchange for a fixed amount of cash that they could print at will. The outcry would be deafening. Yet, in 1933, it happened, and the history books call it statesmanship. But the official story begins to fray when you look at what happened next. After the government had collected the people's gold, after the threat of a $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison had compelled a terrified populace to comply, what did they do? Did they use this consolidated gold reserve to stabilize the dollar at the promised $2,067 per ounce? No. In 1934, with the Gold Reserve Act, Roosevelt and his administration did the unthinkable. They immediately devalued the dollar. The official price of gold was raised to $35 per ounce. In a single stroke, the government had made a 69% profit on the very gold it had just confiscated from its own citizens. Anyone who had dutifully followed the law and turned in their gold had been cheated. They had been forced to sell their most valuable asset at a fixed low price, only to watch the buyer immediately revalue that same asset to a much higher price. It was not economic policy. It was the single largest act of legalized theft in American history. But was it just about profit? Was it merely a cynical cash grab by a desperate government? The evidence suggests something far deeper, far more methodical. This was not a plan conceived in the panicked first 100 days of a new administration. The groundwork had been laid years earlier. Let us examine the primary sources, the ones they don't put in the textbooks. Consider the private correspondence of the era's financial elites, the letters between central bankers, the memos circulating within the newly empowered Federal Reserve. A consistent theme emerges. Gold is referred to as a relic, a fetter, a hindrance to the implementation of a more elastic and centrally managed financial system. They were not trying to save the gold standard. They were trying to kill it. But they knew they could not do it openly. The public still believed in gold. The public trusted what they could hold. So, they devised a plan. A multi-decade strategy to wean the population off of real money. Step 1 was to get the gold. All of it. Not just the gold in the banks, but the gold in the floorboards, the gold in the safe deposit boxes, the gold sewn into the linings of mattresses. Executive Order 6102 was not about stabilizing the banks. It was an inventory. It was a national asset seizure. It was a test of logistics and, more importantly, a test of public compliance. Could they do it? Could a modern government, in a time of crisis, successfully disarm its populace of their financial sovereignty? The answer, chillingly, was yes. But how did they know it would work? This is where we introduce the silenced expert. His name was Dr. Ellsworth Huntington, a Yale professor, but not of economics. He was a geographer and sociologist, known for his controversial theories on the influence of climate on civilization. In the late 1920s, he turned his attention to what he called cultural inertia and social compliance. He wrote a series of obscure papers, published not in economic journals, but in sociological quarterlies, that were quietly circulated among the policy planners of the day. Huntington's thesis was shocking in its simplicity. He argued that modern, urbanized populations, despite their veneer of independence, were uniquely susceptible to mass psychological manipulation, especially during periods of perceived crisis. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing from a 1929 paper that was quietly removed from the Yale Library archives in the 1950s, the citizen of the industrial state, disconnected from the land and dependent on complex, invisible systems for his daily bread, possesses a deep-seated terror of systemic collapse. His belief in the system is not rational. It is a form of religious faith. Therefore, the authority that can convincingly present itself as the sole savior of that system can command almost unlimited obedience, even to the point of the voluntary surrender of property and liberty. Huntington even proposed a hypothetical scenario. He called it the crisis and confiscation model. He argued that to seize a nation's private wealth, one must first manufacture or amplify a crisis of sufficient magnitude to induce a state of collective panic. Then, the state must present the confiscation not as a seizure, but as a patriotic act, a collective sacrifice. The language used must be one of public safety, of national security, of protecting the weak. Finally, there must be a clear and terrifying punishment for noncompliance, ensuring that even those who see through the ruse are cowed into submission. Executive Order 6102 did not just follow Huntington's model. It was a perfect, textbook implementation. The Great Depression was the crisis. The rhetoric was of saving the nation from hoarders and speculators. The punishment was severe. It was a flawless execution of a psychological operation disguised as economic policy. And we know they read him. In the recently unsealed private papers of a prominent Treasury official from that era, a man named William Woodin, who was Roosevelt's first Secretary of the Treasury, a handwritten note was found in the margins of a memo discussing the gold seizure. The note contained a single name, Huntington. The official story, that this was a frantic idea born in the chaos of 1933, falls apart under the weight of such evidence. This was a calculated move, a psychological experiment on a national scale. But the evidence doesn't stop with obscure academics. Let's look at the newspapers. Not the sanitized, curated headlines that make it into the history books. Let's look at the small, local papers, the ones that reported what was actually happening on the ground. From the Denver Mining Gazette, April 28, 1933, federal agents raid safe deposit boxes. Local bank sealed. Citing the president's new order, a team of federal marshals today forcibly opened hundreds of private safe deposit boxes at the First Mercantile Bank of Denver, removing all contents deemed to be monetary gold. Bank officials were served with a gag order. Citizens arriving to access their property were turned away at gunpoint. From the Mobile Register, May 12, 1933, widow fined for possessing family heirlooms. A 64-year-old widow, Mistress Eleanor Riggs, was today fined the sum of $500 for the possession of 5 $20 gold double eagle coins, which she stated were a keepsake from her late husband. Her attempts to argue that the coins were of numismatic and sentimental value were dismissed by the presiding federal magistrate. These stories were not on the front page of the New York Times. They were buried. They were suppressed. They paint a picture not of voluntary compliance, but of a brutal, systematic campaign of intimidation and expropriation. They were running drills. They were testing the limits of their power. How much force was needed? How much resistance would they encounter? Where were the weak points in their enforcement mechanism? And then there is the most damning evidence of all, the deathbed confession. In 1968, a man named Herbert Oakes gave a series of interviews to his grandson, a history student. Oakes had been a mid-level manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the 1930s. His job was to oversee the logistics of the gold confiscation in the largest financial district in the world. He was old, he was dying, and he was no longer afraid. His testimony, recorded on reel-to-reel tape and kept private by the family for decades, is chilling. We were told it was about saving the economy, Oakes said, his voice thin and reedy. But in the planning meetings, the language was different. They called it asset consolidation. They called it clearing the board. I remember one of the senior VPs, a man from Washington. He drew a diagram. It had 2 columns, physical and abstract. Under physical, he wrote gold, land, property. Under abstract, he wrote ledger entries, credit, debt. He then drew a big arrow from the physical column to the abstract column. He said, and I will never forget this, he said, "Gentlemen, our task for the next 50 years is to move the entire contents of this column." He pointed to physical. Into this column, he pointed to abstract. And to do it in such a way that the man on the street believes he is getting richer. The gold confiscation, Oakes continued, was the first major test. It wasn't about the gold itself. It was about proving the principle. The principle that the state could, by fiat, convert a real, physical asset into an abstract ledger entry. If we could do it with gold, the most sacred of all assets, we could eventually do it with anything. This is the buried truth of 1933. It was not a policy. It was a pilot program, a proof of concept for a much grander, more audacious plan. A plan that would lie dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right crisis, the right technology to reach its final, terrifying conclusion. They had tested the public's compliance. They had tested their own enforcement logistics. They had confirmed the theories of men like Huntington. They had successfully converted a physical asset into an abstract one and profited immensely in the process. The rehearsal was over, and it had been a stunning success. Now, all they had to do was wait. They had to wait for the memory of the theft to fade. They had to wait for a generation that had never known a world of real money to come of age. And they had to wait for the technology to mature. The technology that would allow them to perform the same trick, not just with gold, but with everything. The technology that would allow them to move from simple confiscation to total control. So what was this grand unifying theory? What was the ultimate goal that made the 1933 gold seizure merely a preliminary exercise? What was the 50-year plan that the man in the meeting had spoken of? It wasn't just about moving assets from a physical column to an abstract one. That was merely the mechanism. The goal was something far more fundamental. The goal was the complete and total reinvention of the concept of money itself. The goal was to sever, once and for all, the link between wealth and the physical world. We can call this overarching strategy the asset abstraction protocol. It is a theory not of economics, but of power. It posits that true, ultimate power does not come from controlling armies or governments. It comes from controlling the system of value itself. For millennia, that system was anchored to the physical world by gold and silver. This anchor acted as a natural constraint on the power of rulers. A king could not print more gold. He had to mine it, or trade for it, or conquer for it. His power was limited by physical reality. The asset abstraction protocol is a plan to shatter that limitation. It is a plan to create a system where value is unmoored from reality, where it can be created, destroyed, and directed by a small, unelected group of system administrators. The protocol has three distinct phases. Phase 1, consolidation. This was the phase that began in the early 20th century and culminated in the 1933 confiscation. The goal was to remove the primary physical asset, gold, from public circulation and consolidate it under the control of the central authority. By making private ownership illegal and seizing existing stock, the architects of the plan achieved two things. They cornered the market on the world's ultimate financial backstop, and they tested the feasibility of mass confiscation. The success of 1933 proved that Phase 1 was viable. Phase 2, dissociation. This phase ran from roughly the end of World War II until 1971. The goal of this phase was to psychologically dissociate the concept of money from the physical gold that supposedly backed it. This was achieved through the Bretton Woods system. On the surface, Bretton Woods appeared to be a gold standard. International currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar was, in theory, redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. But this redemption was only available to other central banks, not to individuals. This was the critical sleight of hand. For the average person, money was no longer gold. It was not even a certificate directly redeemable for gold, as it had been before 1933. It was now a piece of paper issued by the government, which was in turn backed by a promise that another government held a different piece of paper that was, in turn, backed by a theoretical claim on a bar of metal in a vault somewhere. The chain of redemption was deliberately lengthened and obscured. Over the course of a generation, people simply got used to it. They stopped thinking about the gold. They started thinking in dollars, in francs, in pounds. They started to believe in the paper. The dissociation was working. The memory of real money was fading. The architects of the protocol were patiently allowing an entire generation to grow up inside the matrix of fiat currency, believing it to be the natural state of affairs. They were like zookeepers, slowly conditioning an animal to forget the wild and accept the enclosure as its entire reality. Phase 3, activation. This is the final and most critical phase. The goal is to sever the last remaining link, however tenuous, to the physical anchor. It is the moment the training wheels come off. The moment the system is declared to be self-referential, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the authorities who control it. The moment the abstract ledger becomes the sole definition of wealth. This was the event of August 15, 1971. Nixon's announcement was not a panicked response to a run on Fort Knox, as the official story claims. It was the flicking of a switch. It was the scheduled culmination of Phase 2 and the official beginning of Phase 3. It was the moment the 50-year plan came to fruition. The world was now officially operating on a pure abstract system, just as the man in Herbert Oakes's meeting had diagrammed decades earlier. And who were these architects? Who was this committee that could think in terms of decades and generations? They were not presidents or prime ministers. Those were temporary, public-facing managers. The true architects were the ones who operated in the shadows, beyond the reach of democratic accountability. They were the high priests of the new religion of abstract value. This is where the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, enters the story. Founded in 1930, the BIS is the most powerful, secretive, and unaccountable financial institution on Earth. It is the central bank for central banks. Its headquarters are in Basel, Switzerland. It enjoys legal immunity in the countries of its members. Its premises are considered forever inviolable. The police, the tax authorities, the government officials of its host nation have no right to enter without the permission of the bank's president. It is a sovereign entity, a financial Vatican, beholden to no nation and no law but its own. Its stated purpose is to promote cooperation among central banks. Its true purpose, according to the theory of the Asset Abstraction Protocol, is to serve as the permanent, unelected governing body of the global financial system. It was the BIS that facilitated the flow of money in the 1930s. It was the BIS that provided the forum for the planning of the post-war Bretton Woods system. And it is the BIS that has overseen the transition to a purely fiat, abstract global monetary regime since 1971. The men who met in Basel were the ones who wrote the rules. They were the ones who understood that 1933 was a test. They were the ones who designed the Bretton Woods cage. And they were the ones who decided when to open the door in 1971, not to let the world out, but to lock it into a new, purely digital prison. The grand unifying theory, the Asset Abstraction Protocol, provides a terrifyingly coherent framework. It reframes our history. Events that seem random and chaotic are revealed to be orderly and deliberate. The Great Depression was the pretext for Phase 1. The post-war boom was the conditioning period of Phase 2. The stagflation and crises of the 1970s were the predictable, engineered consequences of activating Phase 3. And the ultimate goal? The endgame of Phase 3 is not just a world of floating fiat currencies. That is merely a transitional state. The endgame is the creation of a single, global, digital currency, managed by a central authority, in which every single transaction is recorded, monitored, and controlled. A world where your ability to buy and sell can be switched off with the click of a button if you fall out of favor with the system's administrators. A world where there is no cache, no anonymity, no escape. A world of total information awareness and total control. They did not just want to get rid of gold because it was a fetter on their ability to print money. They wanted to get rid of it because it was a tool of freedom. Gold is anonymous. It is decentralized. It is sovereign. It cannot be devalued by decree. It cannot be switched off. It is the individual's final check on the power of the state. By confiscating it, then dissociating from it, then abandoning it, they were not just changing the monetary system. They were rewiring the circuitry of power on a global scale. They were moving us all from the physical column to the abstract column, just as the man in the meeting said. And we, the citizens of the 21st century, are the unwitting inhabitants of their grand design. We live our lives on their ledger. Now, let us re-examine the initial anomaly through this new, terrifying lens. Let us return to Frank Miller, the humble data clerk in the sub-basement of the Treasury in August of 1971. With the Asset Abstraction Protocol as our guide, his experience transforms from a strange bureaucratic mystery into a key eyewitness account of the final moments before the coup. The pieces now fall into a chilling, logical order. What did he see? He saw a consolidated bullion ledger. This was the official, internal accounting of the nation's physical gold. And on this ledger, he saw a negative entry so vast it could not be explained by normal operations. He saw a void. The official narrative would have us believe that in August 1971, the vaults at Fort Knox and the New York Fed were brimming with gold, the bedrock of the dollar's value. Frank Miller's testimony suggests this was a lie. The void on his screen was the truth. The gold was already gone. Where did it go? The official story of the 1960s is one of foreign central banks, particularly France and Germany, losing faith in the dollar and redeeming their dollar holdings for gold, draining U.S. reserves. This is presented as the reason Nixon had to act, to stop the run on the bank. But what if that narrative is inverted? What if the gold drain wasn't the cause of the crisis, but a symptom of the plan? Under the Asset Abstraction Protocol, the gold held in U.S. vaults was not a national treasure. It was a global liability. It was the one thing that anchored the entire system to reality. To complete the transition to Phase 3, this liability had to be eliminated. The architects of the plan, operating through the BIS, would have systematically and quietly overseen the distribution of the physical gold out of the central U.S. repository and into other, more compliant central bank vaults around the world. Not in a panic, but as a planned, orderly unwinding. A controlled demolition of the gold standards foundation. The run on gold wasn't a surprise attack. It was a scheduled disassembly. The official story blames greedy foreigners. The truth is that the BS was simply moving its chess pieces into position for the endgame. Frank Miller, in his cold sub-basement, was one of the last people to see the ledger before the books were cooked for good. He saw the final, massive transfer that zeroed out the account. And what was the other report he saw? The one with the high-security clearance? Project Lachesis, Phase 2 projection. In Greek mythology, Lachesis was one of the three fates. She was the allotter, the one who measured the thread of life. An apt, if sinister, name for a project involving the fate of the global economy. The report was a Phase 2 projection. If we consider the post-1971 fiat world as the new operational phase, then this report was a simulation, a projection of how that new system would function. And the comment field, 0-point calibration successful. Legacy asset reconciliation complete. This is the smoking gun. Legacy asset. This is the language of software engineering, of system migration. Gold was the legacy asset. It was the old, obsolete data type that had to be reconciled or written off before the new system could go live. 0-point calibration. They were resetting the entire financial system to a new baseline. A baseline of zero. A baseline where money is no longer a claim on a physical thing, but a pure, unbacked abstraction. Frank Miller did not witness a simple accounting error. He witnessed the final keystrokes of the greatest financial revolution in human history. He saw the moment the anchor chain was cut. And the response? The men in suits. The gag orders. The portable shredder. This was not the behavior of an institution correcting a minor glitch. This was the behavior of a conspiracy cleaning up after itself, eliminating the evidence of its crime from the historical record. Frank Miller's reassignment to counting paperclips was not a punishment. It was a burial. He was a loose end, a witness who had seen too much, and they buried him in a mountain of bureaucratic mundanity. Now, let us introduce the modern seeker. He is a composite character, a stand-in for a small, dedicated group of independent researchers, financial historians, and data analysts who exist on the fringes of mainstream academia and finance. Let's call him Simon. Simon is not a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. He is a former bond trader, a man who spent 20 years inside the machine, trading the very abstract instruments that the protocol created. Simon's journey began with a simple question: where is the gold? Not just the U.S. gold, but all of it. He began digging into the public statements of central banks, the footnotes of IMF reports, the obscure publications of the BS. He found a world of obfuscation, of contradictions, of audits that were never performed, of vaults that were never opened. He is the one who found the archived local newspaper stories from 1933. He is the one who tracked down the grandson of Herbert Oakes and was allowed to digitize the reel-to-reel tapes. He is the one who cross-referenced Treasury personnel records and found the anomalous transfer and sudden security revocation of a clerk named Frank Miller in August 1971. Simon's work, compiled in a series of self-published papers and online forums, paints a devastating picture. He demonstrates, for example, that since the 1950s, not a single comprehensive, independent, third-party audit of the U.S. gold reserves in Fort Knox has ever been published. The audits that are conducted are internal, performed by the very institutions that are supposed to be the custodians of the gold. It is the equivalent of a bank telling its depositors, "Don't worry, we've counted the money ourselves. You can trust us." He points to the strange case of Germany's gold. In 2013, the German Bundesbank, under public pressure, announced a plan to repatriate 674 tons of its gold from vaults in New York and Paris. A simple request, one would think. It is their gold, after all. Yet, the response was bizarre. The Federal Reserve of New York stated that it would take them 7 years to return a mere 300 tons of the gold. 7 years. For a transfer that, in the modern age, should take a matter of weeks. Why the delay? The official explanation was logistical difficulties. Simon provides a more logical and more terrifying explanation. The gold isn't there. Or, more accurately, the single bar of physical gold has been rehypothecated. It has been loaned out, leased out, and used as collateral for dozens of different paper claims. The physical bar may exist, but it is owned by 10 different entities simultaneously in the great abstract ledger in the sky. To return the one physical bar to Germany would be to default on the 9 other paper claims. The entire paper gold market, a multi-trillion-dollar house of cards, would collapse. The 7-year delay was not for logistics. It was to give the system administrators time to quietly go into the market and buy back the physical gold needed to satisfy Germany's request without triggering a panic. This is the world that the Asset Abstraction Protocol created. A world where physical reality is subordinate to the paper shuffling of the Basel Committee. Simon's work is meticulous. It is evidence-based, and it is completely ignored by the mainstream. His papers are not peer-reviewed, because the peers are the very people who have built their careers on the lie. He is not invited to speak at economic conferences. He is not quoted in the financial press. Like Frank Miller, he has been relegated to the institutional equivalent of counting paper clips. He is dismissed as a gold bug, a crank. This is the final, and perhaps most insidious, defense mechanism of the system. It does not need to use men in dark suits to silence a modern seeker like Simon. It can simply render him invisible. It can use the weight of its academic and media apparatus to label him as outside the consensus, to marginalize his views as fringe, and to ensure that his terrifying, logical conclusions never reach the mainstream discourse. The institutional antagonist, the nexus of the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and their overseers at the BIS, has perfected the art of the silent coup. They took the gold in 1933 with force. They took the world off the gold standard in 1971 by decree. And today, they maintain their power not with guns, but with consensus. A manufactured consensus that defines the very boundaries of acceptable thought. But the evidence is there, for those who dare to look. It is in the 1933 newspaper clippings. It is in the voice of a dying man on an old tape. It is in the impossible numbers on a data clerk's printout. And it is in the 7-year delay to move a pile of metal from one basement to another. The pattern is not local. It is not an American phenomenon. The Asset Abstraction Protocol, by its very nature, had to be global. A system of abstract value only works if there is no escape. If even one major country had remained on a true, physical gold standard, it would have acted as a gravitational anchor, a point of comparison that would have exposed the hollowness of the fiat currencies. The entire world had to be brought into the new paradigm. The events after 1971 are not a series of disconnected geopolitical crises. They are the methodical, often brutal, enforcement of the new global operating system. Consider the creation of the petrodollar system. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and one that is often misunderstood. After 1971, the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. So what was it backed by? The official answer is the full faith and credit of the United States government. A more practical answer emerged just a few years later. It was backed by oil. In the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, a deal was struck with Saudi Arabia, and by extension, with OPEC. The deal was simple. OPEC would agree to price all of its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection and political support to the ruling regimes. The genius of this move cannot be overstated. It created an artificial, permanent global demand for US dollars. Any country that needed to buy oil, which was every industrialized country on Earth, first had to acquire US dollars. To get those dollars, they had to sell their goods and services to the United States or trade on the international market. The dollar, having been severed from gold, was now re-anchored to the world's most vital commodity. But notice the nature of this new anchor. Gold is a static, sovereign asset. Oil is a consumable resource. To get it, you must constantly engage in trade, constantly participate in the dollar-based system. The petrodollar system transformed the US dollar from a simple currency into the mandatory transaction layer for the entire global energy market. It was a masterstroke of financial imperialism. And what happened to leaders who challenged this system? What happened to those who sought to create an escape hatch from the dollar-denominated matrix? Look at the history. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, an OPEC member, announced that he would no longer accept US dollars for his country's oil. He would accept euros. This was a direct threat to the petrodollar's monopoly. It was a small tear in the fabric of the abstract system. 3 years later, the United States invaded Iraq for reasons that are still debated, and one of the first actions of the new Coalition Provisional Authority was to switch the Iraqi oil payment system back to US dollars. A decade later, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya began organizing a movement among African nations to create a new currency, a gold-backed dinar, that would be used to price African oil and other resources. He was attempting to create a modern, regional gold standard, a direct competitor to the abstract dollar and euro. Shortly thereafter, a NATO-led military intervention resulted in the overthrow and death of Gaddafi. The plan for the gold-backed dinar died with him. Are these mere coincidences? Or are they the system's immune response, ruthlessly attacking any cell that tries to revert to the old physical standard? The protocol's enforcers no longer need to confiscate gold. They just need to ensure that no one is ever allowed to use it as money again. The pattern repeats across the globe. Let us look at the United Kingdom. In 1999, at the very bottom of a 2-decade bear market in gold, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, announced that the UK would sell off more than half of its national gold reserves. The timing was so inexplicably poor that the event is still known in financial circles as Brown's bottom. The sales crashed the price of gold, costing the UK billions compared to what it would have been worth just a few years later. The official explanation was that gold was a relic of a barbarous age and that the government wanted to diversify its portfolio into interest-bearing currencies. But seen through the lens of the Asset Abstraction Protocol, the motive becomes clearer. The UK, as the historical center of the global financial system, was making a powerful statement. It was a ritual sacrifice. They were publicly demonstrating their commitment to the new abstract system by ostentatiously dumping the old physical asset at the worst possible price. It was a signal to the other members of the club, a demonstration of loyalty to the principles of Basel. Now, let us contrast this with the unique aspect of the American case, the element that makes the story that began in 1933 so foundational. In most of the world, the goal was to dishoard gold from central banks and push it into the shadows of the paper markets. But in the United States, the original crime was different. It was the confiscation from the people. This highlights a crucial difference in strategy. In Europe and Asia, the transition to the abstract system was largely an elite-to-elite affair, a negotiation between central banks and governments. The average citizen had long been disconnected from physical gold as a monetary instrument. But in the United States, with its history of frontier individualism and populist distrust of centralized power, the connection was deeper. There was a cultural memory of sound money. Therefore, the American implementation of the protocol had to be more direct, more brutal. It required Phase 1, consolidation. It required the physical removal of the asset from the hands of the population. They could not simply persuade Americans to abandon gold. They had to take it by force. This is why the events of 1933 are not just a historical footnote. They are the Rosetta Stone for understanding the entire global system we live in today. They reveal the true nature of the architect's intentions. They are not passive administrators of a system that evolved naturally. They are active, coercive social engineers who are willing to use the full power of the state to achieve their objectives. The global pattern is one of coercion, manipulation, and violence. all aimed at a single goal: the universal and mandatory adoption of a purely abstract, centrally controlled system of value. From the battlefields of the Middle East to the auction rooms of London to the impenetrable boardrooms of Basel, the story is the same. The physical is being systematically subordinated to the abstract. Reality is being replaced by the ledger. And it all began with a simple, brutal test in 1933. A test to see if a free people could be frightened into handing over the keys to their own financial sovereignty. A test that, tragically, they passed with flying colors. So we are left with the final, most pressing question. Why? What is the ultimate motive for this century-long, multi-trillion-dollar conspiracy to replace real money with an abstract system of control? Is it merely greed? Is it just about the 69% profit the government made in 1934, scaled up to a global level? The answer is no. Greed is a motive, but it is a shallow one. The men who architected this system are playing a much longer game. Their motives are deeper, more philosophical, and infinitely more terrifying. Let us posit 3 escalating theories for the suppression. The first, and most obvious, motive is control over policy. A government on a gold standard is a government in a straitjacket. It cannot fund endless wars, build vast welfare states, or bail out its favored corporations simply by printing money. It must tax or borrow, both of which have clear political limits. Gold imposes discipline. The architects of the asset abstraction protocol saw this discipline not as a virtue, but as a fatal flaw. They wanted to be free. Free to manage the economy, to stimulate growth, to fight recessions, to fund their social and military ambitions without the annoying constraint of physical reality. The abandonment of gold was, in this sense, a declaration of independence from fiscal consequence. It was the key that unlocked the public treasury to the whims of the political class. But this is only the first level. The second, deeper motive is control over the individual. In a world of physical cash and anonymous gold, a person can exist outside the system. They can trade, save, and transact without seeking the permission of a bank or the government. They possess true financial sovereignty. This is anathema to the central planner. The abstract system, especially in its final, purely digital form, eliminates this possibility. When every transaction is electronic, every transaction is tracked. Every purchase, every donation, every movement of wealth leaves a permanent, searchable record. This is not just about preventing crime, as they claim. It is about creating a panopticon, a prison where the walls are invisible but all-encompassing. It is about the power to know everything about everyone. Imagine a world where your bank account can be frozen not by a court order, but by an algorithm that flags your political donations as problematic. Imagine a world where your access to capital is determined by your social credit score. This is not a dystopian fantasy. It is the logical endpoint of the system they have been building for 100 years. It is the power to enforce conformity by controlling the very means of survival. And this leads to the third, and most profound, motive. It is the most difficult to accept, because it moves beyond the realm of politics and economics into the realm of the theological. The ultimate motive is the attainment of godlike power. What is the power of a god? It is the power to create something from nothing. Fiat lux, let there be light. What is the power of a modern central banker? Fiat pecunia, let there be money. By severing money from any physical anchor, they have seized the divine prerogative of creation. They can create trillions of dollars, euros, or yen with a few keystrokes. They can conjure wealth out of thin air, directing it to their friends and allies, inflating away the savings of their enemies. They have become the creators and destroyers of economic worlds. This is the ultimate hubris. The man in Herbert Oakes's meeting who spoke of moving assets from the physical to the abstract was not just an economist. He was a would-be deity. He was describing the process of supplanting the messy, unpredictable reality of the physical world with a clean, ordered, and totally controlled reality of his own design. The ledger is their new scripture. The algorithm is their new commandment. This is the true reason for the century of suppression. It is not about money. It is about the nature of reality itself. They are not just trying to control your bank account. They are trying to control the definition of value. And by controlling the definition of value, they control you. Let us return, for a final moment, to the human element, to the witnesses who saw pieces of this truth and were silenced, ignored, or buried. Think of the widow in Mobile, fined for possessing her late husband's coins. She wasn't just losing money. She was being told that her personal, tangible connection to her own past was now illegal, subordinate to the needs of a distant, abstract state. Her story is the story of all of us, in miniature. Think of Dr. Ellsworth Huntington, the Yale academic. His theories, so prescient and so chilling, were not celebrated. They were buried. His work became a classified user's manual for the powerful, not a warning for the public. Think of Herbert Oakes, the Fed insider, who carried the burden of his knowledge for decades, only able to speak the truth when the specter of death had freed him from the fear of reprisal. His final testimony is a ghost story for the modern age, a tale of a world haunted by the specter of a crime committed in plain sight. They built everything, he might have said. We built nothing. They built a new reality on a foundation of lies. And finally, think of Frank Miller, the quiet, precise data clerk who stumbled upon the 0 point. He is the ultimate protagonist of this story because he is us, an ordinary individual doing his job who accidentally pulls back the curtain and sees the horrifying machinery whirring away behind the stage. His fate, to be discredited, reassigned, and rendered irrelevant, is the fate reserved for all who question the official narrative. The truth, they believe, can be managed. It can be suppressed. It can be buried under a mountain of data, a century of propaganda, and a universe of abstract complexity. But truth has a quality that is much like gold. It can be buried, but it does not decay. It can be melted down and recast, but it does not lose its substance. It can be hidden in the deepest vault, but it retains its intrinsic value. And eventually, inevitably, it finds its way back to the surface. The evidence persists. The numbers do not lie. The memory of what was stolen endures, encoded in the very system they built to conceal it. They didn't just take the gold. They took the anchor. And now, we are all adrift, in a sea of their own making, waiting for a tide that will, one day, carry us back to solid ground.